Okay, in this segment we're going to talk about prejudice. I've found this little, I guess it's supposed to be a poster off the internet. Stop prejudice now. Okay, well, good luck with that, right? Because let's talk about what prejudice is. Prejudice is an unjustified attitude toward a group. I mean, if you break down the word prejudice, it means prejudge, right? So I don't know you as an individual. I know that you have superficial characteristics that I can observe from the outside that allow me to place you into a category. And if I have negative attitudes towards the category that you belong to, then I may behave negative, hold negative attitudes towards you as an individual. In the same vein, if I have positive attitudes towards that group that I have placed you in, then I may treat you in an unjustifiably positive way. I may assume good things about you because you belong to a group that I have positive attitudes towards. So prejudice is an unjustified attitude. It's not a necessarily negative attitude. It's an attitude that is not deserved. Now, discrimination is when you behave differently towards a person because of their membership in a group. Again, it's not necessarily negative. We tend to think of discriminatory behavior as a bad thing because we tend to use that term mostly to talk about denying a person entry into a school or a job or something like that because they belong to a particular group. But there's also favoritism that's discriminatory, where because you belong to the same group I do, I assume that you have characteristics that I would value, and so I offer you a job or something like that. So for discrimination and prejudice, we're talking about any kind of unjustified attitude or behavior that is being applied to all the members of a particular group. Rather than treating people as individuals and responding to them based on their individual characteristics. That's really the distinction. Treating a person based on their group membership versus treating them as an individual. A stereotype is a generalized belief about a group that we try to extend out to every member of the group. Now, you might have heard, there's a grain of truth in every stereotype. Well, that's true. I mean, a stereotype might be based on the fact that, let's say, for example, men tend to be better parallel parkers than women. That may be true, that on average, men are better parallel parkers than women. And actually, study after study has actually shown that. So I'm using that example because I can never get in trouble if I use sex as an example and use my own sex as a side. That doesn't look that good. Okay, so that's why I picked that one. Here's the trouble we can get into. Okay, so men may be better parallel parkers, but that does not mean that every man is a better parallel parker than every woman. And that's where stereotypes get us into trouble. There's a grain of truth. I mean, if I put a gun to your head, which I would never do, but let's just say, and said, you have two people in front of you, a man and a woman. Who would you rather have do your parallel parking? Say now, pick. You would be safe saying, I'll take the man. That would be statistically the safe thing to do. Okay, that's true. But when you meet a woman, you wouldn't want to necessarily assume that she doesn't know how to parallel park, because this is an individual woman who may not conform to the average. And so it would be wrong to stereotype her as being an example of the average until she's shown you whether she's an example of the average. So that's the issue with stereotyping, is that it probably is true as long as you're confining yourself exclusively to the group. It's probably true as if you're being forced and you have to pick a side, you have to make a decision. The safe statistical decision would be to go with the stereotype. Where we get into trouble is when we meet individuals and then we treat them as if they have the characteristics that we assume that they have because of our stereotypes. That's where we get into trouble. Just because we agree with someone doesn't make them non-stereotyping. There was a couple of years ago, people camping out on Wall Street and a lot of anger towards the banking industry and stuff like that. And a lot of people agreed with it, and so they saw statements like this. This financial district is responsible for most of the poverty and suffering on this planet. That's a bit of a extension, isn't it? I mean, I think we might say that this person might be stereotyping bankers in the financial district, people who work on the financial district. They might be. I think we'd be safe in saying this person seems to be stereotyping. But a lot of people during the time that Occupy Wall Street was going on would say, but they're right, so it's okay to stereotype. They're right. Well, it's a stereotype when you're applying the belief to every member of a group, treating any individual who you meet as if they are exemplary of the group that they belong to. That's where the risk is run. Not all bankers contribute to poverty and suffering on the planet. Not everybody who works on Wall Street contributes. These are generalizations that, when applied to individuals, become hurtful. And that's what I'm talking about. So that's the difference between stereotyping and, towards a group and applying statistics towards a group versus stereotyping and treating an individual as if they are the statistical norm for their group. Okay, now this chart is kind of an interesting one because it shows attitudes towards interracial dating. Sorry, I got something in my throat. And we've got the percentage of people who support interracial dating, and then on the y-axis, and across the x we've got different years, starting as far back as 1987 and going to 2009. And so we've got generation by generation. We've got the greatest generation, people who were born before 1928. We've got the silent generation, those between 28 and 45. We've got the baby boomers, 46 to 64, and then we've got the Gen Xers who are born 65 to 76, and then Gen Y, who are the people who are born after 77. People have started calling them millennials. And 77 might be off. A lot of people say that that's more like 85, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So you see the stair step up the generations. The oldest people have the lowest rates of support for interracial dating. The youngest generations have the most positive, the most support for interracial dating. So across generations, you're seeing attitudes changing. And then if you look at the line for the silent generation and the baby boomers, you see that as a generation across time, their attitudes have softened towards interracial dating. You'll notice Gen X and Gen Y have been high and stable pretty much across their generational lifespans. But the baby boomers and the silent generation, you can see that softening of attitudes. Prejudice can change. I mean, a lot of times people act like it's hopeless, that if you have a person who already believes something, you're not going to be able to change their mind. There are a lot of things that we have believed over our lifetimes. All of you listening, there are things that you've believed in your life, and then you found out that that belief was incorrect, and you changed your mind. The same thing happens with any beliefs that we hold, whether they're prejudicial beliefs or they're just incorrect beliefs. The thing about prejudicial beliefs is that a lot of times they've been reinforced over time by other people agreeing with the prejudice, or other people sort of rewarding us for holding prejudicial attitudes or whatever, encouraging us, liking us better if we hold those attitudes. And so it may be harder to get us to change our opinion because we've been rewarded for it so often in the past, things like that. But it's obviously changeable. I mean, people's attitudes soften over time, and so prejudice is not a hopeless situation. Okay, now there's something called automatic prejudice. One of the things that we have all learned over the past probably 40 years is not to say prejudicial things. There's been a really big push in the past probably 5 to 10 years to really get people not to say things that could offend someone else. And one of the problems with teaching us all not to say certain things is that we all just learn that behavior. Don't say stuff. But that doesn't necessarily affect what we think. It doesn't necessarily, in fact, it may fuel the prejudicial things that we're thinking because we're frustrated by the fact that we have to change our behavior to conform to other people's demands. And so that little rebellious nature that most of us have deep inside of us, we're like, you know what, but I still believe it. Even though I'm not allowed to say it, I know I can't say that here, I still believe it. And so what we've noticed in research on prejudice is that a lot of prejudices have gone underground, where people know better, like in this little percent of people who are supporting interracial dating. People know that the correct answer is to say, I approve. People know that, whether they actually approve or not. I just was watching something on TV, and the guy said he was dating somebody who was not his same race, and he said he was nervous about introducing his girlfriend to his dad because he said, my dad doesn't believe in interracial dating. And I thought to myself, how jarring that was. I mean, you don't hear a person expressing those kinds of prejudicial attitudes anymore. You know, I don't approve of interracial dating. I mean, you hardly ever on TV hear somebody, and this wasn't, like scripted. This was a reality show. And so you hardly ever hear of somebody actually having expressed those kinds of opinions. Most people know better than to say stuff like that, and certainly in public. And so what we're worried about, though, is that we may know how to act in public, we may know what to say, but we may be still harboring prejudice under the surface. So the concept of automatic prejudice comes up. Okay, so there was a study where, and I'm doing a really bad job of replicating it, but hopefully you were looking at the screen. I'll give you another chance at it. So look at the dot, and this is going to go way slower than the way it flashed on the screen in the actual study. So you're flashed two pictures in sequence, and your job is to name the second thing. And we don't even care if you're super detailed on it. Your choices are weapon or tool. What they found is that when the tool, like it was in this case, when the tool was preceded by an African American face, people were more likely to mistake the tool for a gun, for a weapon. They call that automatic prejudice. Of course, that's obviously not a gun. In the study, they flashed it really fast. It was only a few milliseconds long that the picture was actually on the screen. So people were really having to sort of make a snap judgment. They were looking at the dot, they saw a face, saw something else, either weapon or tool, and they had to say what they thought the second one was. What's interesting is it wasn't a white person making judgments and saw black people having guns. It was all people, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, who viewed those pictures, saw the object as a gun more frequently when it followed an African American face than when it followed a Caucasian face, or I think it was only black and white faces in the study. That kind of implies that underneath all of our correct things that we know to say, people may be harboring automatic prejudices, where we make assumptions about what would accompany an African American face, and we make this error based on this kind of automatic prejudice. Now, I mentioned prejudice based on gender a second ago. When people are shown faces, they tend to prefer feminine faces. Even when it's a male face, they tend to find a feminized male face more attractive than a masculinized one. So you see on the top panel, they feminized his face a little bit by softening his jaw, lightening up his eyebrows, sort of, very subtle. In the bottom one, they sort of widened his jaw, filled in his eyebrows. His nose is a little bit extended on the bottom one. There's the 5 o'clock shadow is a little bit more clear. His hair looks different, right? The bottom one is judged to be more masculine. The top one is viewed as more attractive. But, so even though people may prefer a feminine face, people tend to prefer male babies over girl babies. And a lot of people think, well, that's just in certain countries. No, that's all around the world. Especially first-time parents report wanting a boy first. It's a really consistent difference that people prefer boy babies. Worldwide, when adultery occurs, somehow the wife gets blamed, or the mistress gets blamed, much more likely than the man. A lot of times men are actually dismissed because they have urges and whatever. Maybe his wife wasn't tending to his needs. Maybe the mistress lured him away. Like women get blamed for adultery even though both partners or all three partners might be carrying equal weight. Women who behave assertively or who are ambitious are oftentimes seen as, negative, right? We have words that we use for women. A lot of them start with B. Um, One of them, they tried to um, get us all to stop saying bossy. We're not supposed to say bossy anymore because that's something that we say about women, but we typically don't say about men. Because assertiveness is seen as abrasive in a female. Women who are pursuing their career oftentimes are seen as, well, why? It's kind of cool for a little while, but aren't you supposed to eventually want to have some kids? And, like that kind of thing. So we may prefer a feminized face, but there are a lot of things about being female that are not the preferred thing. So, where does prejudice come from? Now, earlier on, at the very beginning of this, I had said, well, good luck getting rid of prejudice, because really this is why. I mean, there are the roots of prejudice, the tendency for us to want to prejudge, runs so deep. One source of prejudice is social inequality. When one group has fewer resources than another group, or has fewer opportunities than another group, the group who's in the benefited position oftentimes assume that the people who are in the less benefited position are there through some fault of their own. That somehow they deserve to be in the less benefited position. I was at a teaching conference one time, and we were doing this little game, they called it. And I play this game with my social psychology students. So if you take social psychology from me later, act like you didn't hear the story. But we were all given, we were placed into 3 different groups just based on how, when we arrived. You know what I mean? Like the first people to arrive were all sort of funneled over to this one cluster of chairs. And then once that cluster got full, then they started funneling people to the next cluster of chairs. And finally we ended up with 3 groups of people that were roughly the same number of people. So we're all in our little groups. And they gave us names. One group was circles, one was triangles, and one was squares. I was a triangle. And then they gave us each an envelope that contained little tokens. And the rules are kind of complex, but let's just put it this way. Our job was to try and trade with other people to get the best combination of tokens for ourselves so we could get the most points accumulated. And so we were told that we had to approach somebody else, grasp hands with that other person, and you had to hold hands until you guys could agree on a trade. And so that's what we were doing. And so the first round of trading, we all sort of milled around. We didn't really know what was going on. Whatever, we got done. And then we were assigned to go up to the front of the board and write down how many points we had accumulated at that point. And we weren't allowed to show anybody else our tokens. We had to keep our tokens in the envelope, and it had to be a big secret. So we all wrote our points on the board. And then they kind of organized us by points and showed us that the people in the square group were earning a lot more points than the people in the triangle group, who were earning more points than the circle group. So, and I noticed most of my colleagues were in the square group. I was over in the triangle group, and then one of our colleagues was over in the square group. So I thought, how are my colleagues doing so much better than I am? That's really weird. So at the next trading session, I met up with the colleague who was in the low scoring circle condition, and we grasped hands and we started to exchange. And he said to me, I don't think the tokens were equally distributed. And I was like, paranoid much? Like, what's wrong with you? Of course they were equally distributed. It's a stupid game. This is a teaching game. Why would they not set it up fairly? So we made our little exchange, and I kept trying to approach my other colleagues who were in the high scoring group, and none of them would grasp hands with me. So I was like, why are you guys avoiding me? And I started taking it a little bit personally. So we did a total of 3 rounds. In the third round, the highest scoring people got to change some rules and got to have a little bit of power, stuff like that. Anyway, so at the end, my group was still in the middle level of scoring, and I thought, well, I did at least better than those guys did, and I thought, and I did better than that one colleague, so I guess I'm not such a bad trader, but I wasn't sure why my other colleagues had done so well. Okay, this is coming back to social inequality, and here it goes. Okay, so then they revealed what the point of the game was. My colleague in the low-scoring group was right. They had not equally distributed the tokens. It really had nothing to do with our trading skills. It had to do with as soon as the high-scoring group realized we're the high-scoring group, and that if we grasp hands with somebody, we have to make a trade with them. and that those people have fewer tokens than we have by definition, or they would be in higher scoring groups, they started avoiding us. They tried to protect what they had. And in the third round of trading, they made rules that would help to ensure that they could protect what they had. Like they made one rule, like you can't trade outside of your own group. The people who were in the entitled position assumed that we all deserved to be in the poorer condition than them. What was really funny is I lucked out and got in the middle group, and I had the experience that the middle class always has. I'm like, well, I'm doing better than them. Yeah, maybe I'm not doing as well as those people, but I'm reasonably satisfied with the total points I came up with. That's kind of what the middle always feels like, right? Because we have our upward and our downward comparisons we can make. My friend, who was in the low scoring group, looked around and said, this isn't fair and there's no way I can ever dig my way out of here. And so he looked at the entitled people, the people with the higher score, he looked at them as, well, entitled. He looked at them as not deserving to have been randomly assigned to be the people who got more points. Social inequality makes you start to think prejudicially towards other members who you normally might have liked, who, had you been on time to the group, you probably would have been in the group with because you were friends with them. But once there's social inequality, suddenly we start to look at each other suspiciously, and we start to think that the entitled people did something underhanded to get into that position, and that the disadvantaged people somehow did something wrong, and that's why they deserve to be in the disadvantaged position. Another aspect of the social factor that goes into prejudice is that we tend to favor our own group. I have a little video if you want to look at the in-group bias video. Just run the slideshow and you can click on that. But the idea with the in-group bias is that we tend to favor people who share characteristics with us. In the video, it's a great demonstration from this teacher who would sort her students based on eye color, and would convince the students, these were third graders, she would convince them that the kids with the blue eyes were better than the kids with the brown eyes, and like that. And it was really shocking how she had this really nice, sweet group of third graders until she disrupted it with this, in-group favoritism exercise. And next thing you know, these kids are getting into fights at recess because this one called me brown eyes, and it was really shocking how quickly these little third graders piled on into the, favoring their own group and not liking the other group. It would be less shocking, though, if you didn't see it every time people are placed into groups. I mentioned in an earlier segment that I don't like group work because of social loafing. I also don't like group work because of the in-group bias. When you put groups together, the members of the group start to see themselves as a cohesive unit, and they have to protect each other. So they won't tell me if there's somebody not carrying their weight. They'll keep it a secret until it's finally annoyed them to such a point that now it's too late to do anything about it, but now they just had to let me know that this person hasn't been carrying their weight. The in-group bias makes us loyal to our group mates. Even though in a lot of these groups that I've ever done, I randomly assign the students to be in groups. I don't let them pick their friends and be in groups. I go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the ones are in one group, all the twos are in another group. And so random assignment, and they'll still immediately display in-group bias, and they'll protect their own. You can place groups together on stupid, superficial things, and I do this in social psychology all the time. Get together based on footwear. So you got the flip-flop wearers over here, you got the sneaker wearers over there, and you got the dress shoe people over there. And the group's job is to think of 10 reasons why the other groups are wearing the type of shoes that they're wearing. And, usually it starts off benign. They say things like, well, maybe they are more comfortable like that, or they like to look nice, or whatever. But by the end, they start saying things like, well, because they're lazy, or because they're shallow, or, and it starts to get into more basic things that kind of imply that, well, people who wear shoes like I wear, that makes sense. Somebody who wears shoes like that obviously has these characteristics that are not desirable. That's in-group bias. We tend to favor our own group. So teams, that's the whole benefit, and you're not supposed to betray your team. We've had a lot of NFL scandals going on, and people are talking about how we shouldn't be protecting our teammates when if you get wind of something that your teammate might have done, you're supposed to tell, right? That's really asking humans to violate a very basic instinct, which is to protect our own, defend the people who belong to the same group we do. So I don't know how effective that can be when our natural tendency is to protect our own. Okay, so we have social roots of prejudice. We also have emotional roots of prejudice. When things go bad, when we're feeling scared, when we're feeling anxious, when something like that, we tend to want to find someone to blame. I'm feeling like this because something exists in the world that's making me feel like this. We call this the scapegoat theory. One of the things I've noticed, and some of you may be acutely aware of what I'm going to say, is that every time there's an economic downturn, the first thing that people start talking about is closing our borders. Immediately, the problem that we're having economically would be solved if we had no immigrants. And it's like every single time. Since I've been an adult, I've been through several recessions, and it's like within weeks of the announcement that there's any kind of downturn in the economy that people start complaining about immigrants again. That's a scapegoat. In fact, that Occupy Wall Street poster that I showed you earlier, that's a scapegoat where, I have student loans totaling $100,000 and it's these bankers' fault. That's a scapegoat approach where we're looking like, okay, I just graduated from college, I don't have a job because we're in an economic downturn, I've got $100,000 in student loans to pay. Whose fault is this, right? And so we start looking around and try and figure out, why am I in this condition? And that's basically what scapegoat theory is about. We look for someone to blame so that it'll help make us feel more in control. We don't like feeling like we're out of control. When we are experiencing any kind of temporary frustration, you see a spike in people expressing prejudicial attitudes towards other groups. It probably has to do with fear. When people are experiencing fear, and we can detect it through the activity of their amygdala, we see that their prejudice level goes up. When they are not experiencing fear, we see that their amygdala cools down. We see them expressing less prejudicial attitudes. It seems like fear drives a lot of it. So when we talk about the emotional roots, we're usually talking about fearfulness. By the way, there's another video there that blame is another link, so you can watch a little scapegoat there. My final example of where prejudice comes from is the cognitive roots of prejudice. And there are a few categories of cognitions that can lead to prejudicial behaviors. We use categories to categorize each other all the time. Male, female, old, young, my race, other race, my school, other school, things like that. We like to form categories. It simplifies our processing. This link, I don't think this is a video. Hold on a second. I think this might be a... Oh, no, it's a video, too. I thought it was an activity. The other race effect. Oh, yeah. This is actually a really good video. It's a poor quality. Somebody else videotaped it and put it on YouTube, but it's a clip from The Good Wife. And one of the things that we notice in cognitions is that people are not very good at recognizing the subtle differences among members of other races, different from their own. A lot of times people accuse white people of not being able to tell the difference among black people, right? And it's portrayed as if it's white people can't tell, or they don't care, and so they don't pay attention, stuff like that. It's all races don't do very well in identifying among members of other races. And so in this video that I've got, they have a white guy judging among some black people on the video, and then they get a woman who is of Indian descent, and she can't tell the difference among white people. And she was feeling all smug watching the white guy bumble around until she realized, wait a minute, I can't tell the difference between two very similar looking white guys. All of us have difficulty seeing the details in other races. The more exposure we have to members of other races, the better we are. But it's a tough one. Here we have okay, so on the bottom, on the X, we have the race of the people in the photos. So the person in the photo is either black or is white. And then we have the accuracy of recognition on the Y-axis. And black subjects are better at recognizing black photos, and white subjects are better at recognizing white people in photos. And you see that nice beautiful X where you see that it's clearly switching sides, where the blacks are good at blacks and whites are good at whites, and that's, we're in between, we have trouble in between. The power of vivid cases refers to, we notice things that are noticeable. So if you are exposed to, let's say, a really flamboyant display of gay pride. Here we have a gay pride parade, right? And that's the only introduction you have that you're aware of to people who are gay. I always like to point out, everybody probably knows some gay people in real life, but they don't necessarily know that they know gay people. If you think that this is the only time you've ever seen a gay person, this becomes your vivid case. And when you think about a gay person, this is what's going to come to mind. And so that can make you think that all gay people, are those their underwear, or do you think they're in swim trunks? I'm not sure what they're wearing. But you might think that it's really common for gay men to have little white bottoms on, no shirts, stuff painted on their chests, apparently dancing in front of people. And you might develop a prejudicial attitude that that's how all gay people are. That's what vivid cases do for us. And so it allows us to form attitudes. Now, it could be positive attitudes also. If they only, for example, when you were a kid, the smartest kid in your math class was Asian, you may come to the conclusion that all Asians are good at math. And all the Asians in the class who are listening to this right now are going, I'm not very good at math. They're saying, I've been subject to that prejudice, where the assumption is that I'll be good at something that somebody that has been good at. A vivid case sticks in our mind. So then you assume that everybody in the group has that same characteristic. The just world belief is our incorrect assumption that people get what they deserve. And so when something good happens to somebody, we assume that they must be a good person. And when something bad happens to them, they must be a bad person. They must have deserved that in some fashion. I found this sign: society teaches don't get raped rather than don't rape. And it's a really common prejudicial attitude. When a woman gets raped, the first questions are, well, what was she wearing? What was she doing there, right? That's fueled by this hindsight bias. Now that we know how it worked out, she should have known not to be there. Cognitive dissonance. We don't want to think that the world's an unsafe place, and so we'd rather blame the victim. We do this with people who we find out have gotten cancer, right? We'll ask them things like, did you ever smoke? Were you ever exposed to asbestos? What things did you do that brought this on, so that I can reassure myself that I don't do those things, and so I probably won't have this happen. That's our hindsight. Now that we see that you've got something, we want to find out how we can prevent it, as if the world is just, and we can do things to prevent things that were going to happen to us anyway. So this belief that we get what we deserve leads some people to think, well, I'll be really, really good and nothing bad will happen to me, right? I'll be really, really good and that'll protect me. Or, well, karma will get that guy anyway. Eventually, something bad will happen to them. These are incorrect beliefs that we carry around with us that allow us to think negative thoughts about groups or positive thoughts about groups. A lot of times people feel just gobsmacked when they find out that something bad happened to someone who has been doing all the right things, following all the rules, and something bad happened to them. And it's like, I thought being good protected me. The world is not just. We all know that. We all say that. We all realize the world's not fair and stuff like that. But the world literally is not just. Random stuff happens. And that's just, unfortunately, the way the world works. All right, so let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back and we'll talk in the next segment about aggression.